Good morning. Most significant battle in the Pacific theater of operations in World War II was certainly the Battle of Midway. It's been recounted in books and movies. You know the names of Nimitz and Halsey, other great heroes of that battle, but you may not know that the man who probably secured victory more than anybody else was a man named Commander Joseph Rochefort. Anybody? Rochefort was the head of the U.S. Navy's Station Hypo. It was the code-breaking unit in the Pacific, tasked with breaking the Japanese naval code entitled JN-25. It was by the work of these anonymous people, most of them musicians, because Rochefort believed that musicians had the best chance of recognizing patterns and breaking code. He assembled a hodgepodge collection of code breakers in order to develop a strategy. They finally uncovered the target, the date, and the approximate order of battle for the battle that came to be known as Midway. They had to piece it together because military intelligence isn't simply overhearing the enemy saying, we're going to attack this place on this day at this time. It's a matter of taking bits and pieces like a jigsaw puzzle and assembling them until you have enough, maybe not all the pieces, but enough to guess accurately at what the picture is. They played counter-espionage by leaking information that they knew the Japanese would pick up on, that Midway Island was short of fresh water. And sure enough, they were able to pick up a Japanese transmission that the target of the battle was now short of fresh water. So they were able to identify the target as Midway Island. They did things like study weather reports for cloud cover. As they tracked cloud cover, it led them to estimate, from the work of U.S. meteorologists, it allowed them to estimate where the Japanese might try and hide their carriers from the airplanes trying to find them. All bits and pieces, no single piece of it enough by itself, but when assembled, it became, it gave to the American forces the advantage and eventually the victory. Spiritual battles, likewise, do not always involve a straightforward confrontation, but rather a recognition of evidences that point to a common source of enemy activity. That's what we find today in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. We've been teaching through the Gospel of Mark now for several months, and as we come to this next episode, remember where we finished last week. Jesus and 3 of his disciples have gone up on the mountain for what we call the transfiguration. And in that moment, they misunderstood. Peter blurts out, let's build 3 tabernacles. Let's just stay here on the mountaintop. And on their way down the mountain, Jesus is explaining to the 3 the purpose of all of that. And he's taking it as a teaching opportunity. But when they get back to the bottom of the mountain, they discover that there is a ruckus. There is a crowd that has assembled, and there seems to be some sort of disturbance going on. And so Jesus leads the others as they walk towards this to find out what's happening. And what they will discover is that when they get there, there is a father who has a son who has suffered for years under a demonic oppression and probably additionally a physical malady, much like what we would refer to as epilepsy. He comes to find Jesus only to discover that Jesus is gone, but that's okay. In the ancient world, a follower of a teacher was viewed as having the same authority of that teacher. So he turns to the 9 disciples who are there, outlines his problems, and they say, no problem. We've done this before. Mark chapter 6, we saw the disciples go out. They had authority over demons. They were astonished, really, at how the demons responded to the name of Christ that they were able to use. And so in this instance, they said, no problem. We've got this. Jesus doesn't need to be here. We'll take care of it for you. Only to find that this demon would not leave regardless of what these disciples did. Now, seizing the moment, we find a group of scribes, religious teachers who are there probably keeping tabs on Jesus and his disciples. They're back out of Gentile territory. They're back in the region of Galilee. And so the scribes have been assigned to keep tabs on them. And what we have is an interesting situation. Failing to solve the father's problem about the boy's physical and spiritual situation, there's some question in the crowd now about why the disciples aren't sufficient to the task. In fact, there's some disturbance in the mind of the disciples themselves about why they're not sufficient to the task. But you can bet that the whole ruckus was stirred up by the scribes beginning to accuse them of being fakers, of being false teachers, of never having any actual spiritual power all along. In the same way that they accused Jesus of being empowered by the enemy, now they're probably making fun and ridiculing the disciples as people whose false presentation has finally been unveiled. Now, the question that nobody ever asks is, why didn't the scribes just take care of the demon problem? Well, because it's easier to throw rocks at the other guys, but that's another story. Jesus is going to show up, and we're going to see the strategy of Satan unveiled in this story in bits and pieces, so that I think Mark's intention was to show a number of things in this story, but at least part of it is he wants us to understand how Satan acts from his side of spiritual warfare. Jesus and the 3 are going to come down. We finished last week with Mark chapter 9, verse 13, so we'll begin this morning with verse 14. Follow along with me. And when they came back to the disciples, meaning the 3 that had been on the mountain with Jesus, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately, when the entire crowd saw Jesus, they were amazed. And as they ran up, they were greeting him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." And Jesus answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around, foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." And immediately the boy's father cried out and was saying, "I do believe, help my unbelief." Now when Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit and saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again." And after crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he stood up. All right, let's talk about this episode. This is the last exorcism that is recorded in the book of Mark, and I think it has several purposes. First of all, he wants to display the inability of the disciples. We'll talk about that in just a minute. He wanted to give insight into what discipleship looks like. He wanted to instruct what would become the church for after the time when Jesus is ascended and no longer bodily present. Here, it's interesting. I love this sentence that Jesus, they see the ruckus and they turn and walk towards the crowd, and somebody spots Jesus, and just seeing Jesus is enough to provoke amazement. And the crowd rushes to him because now we're going to see what's really going on. The scribes had probably impugned Jesus. They mocked his followers. And the implication was Jesus is not the guy that you think he is. He doesn't have the power to do all these things. It's all been a big illusion, a magic show, a trickery from the beginning. And so the crowd sees Jesus and thinks, now we're going to find out. And so Jesus and the other three make their way. And he probably is asking the question of the scribes, what are you arguing with them about? I think it was probably the scribes. It could have been anybody in the text isn't clear, but there is this sense of Jesus sort of putting himself between the scribes and his 9 disciples. You've been ragging on them. Okay, I'm here now. Like a big brother that steps in between his little brother and the bully. What were you arguing with them about? Before the scribes can answer, the Father steps up and begins to explain the situation. He says, I have a son who has this problem, and I brought him to you, but you weren't here, and so your disciples said that they could take care of this. Now, it's interesting because we have to ask, why did the disciples, why were they not able to solve this problem when in Mark chapter 6, we know that they had great success against demons? The implication of the text is that as they came and the Father came and said, hey, I'm looking for Jesus, and they said, Jesus is not here. And he said, oh, I've got a problem. And they said, oh, well, tell us the problem because we can handle it. Here's what we're going to find in this story as we consider the disciples. They fell victim to something that happens to all of us sometimes, and that is they had been with Jesus just enough to think that they had plenty of Jesus to do the rest of the work on their own. You see, the question that's going to come to mind, and Jesus is going to deal with it, but they probably, when the Father came, they probably said, hey, not a problem, we'll take care of it. Only to go through the motions, they certainly invoked the name and the authority of Jesus, just like they had done in Mark chapter 6. Only this demon wouldn't respond. He wouldn't leave. And they were left wringing their hands, wondering why this situation was different than the situations they'd experienced before. Now, we're going to find out from the way Jesus responds, but he comes and they're right there in the middle. The crowds have come around. The scribes are probably mocking them. They're probably accusing them. It's created a real ruckus. Jesus shows up at just the right time, and he says, and the Father begins to describe the situation. I brought my son possessed with a spirit that makes him mute, and whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. Now, what he's describing from the symptoms is what we would, in our day and time, probably describe as epilepsy. The question in some commentaries and scholars that I've looked at, they often dismiss this and say, it wasn't really demonic, it was just epilepsy. And in a more primitive time, as far as medical knowledge and anatomy, they really didn't understand that. And so any illness that was disturbing or confusing, they attributed that to demonic forces. And yet, the reason I dismiss that kind of casual approach to this passage is that, first of all, Jesus takes it seriously as a demonic presence. In order to dismiss this as just epilepsy, we have to say that Jesus made a mistake, that he didn't get it right. The other thing is, epilepsy does have all of those symptoms, but there were additional symptoms beyond just the typical things that we associate with epilepsy. The father said often the boy would be thrown into the fire or thrown into the water in a very self-destructive kind of behavior. That's not typical of epilepsy, but it is typical of demon oppression. You see, here's the thing about the demonic, and we've talked about this along the way in the Gospel of Mark. What is the whole thing about demons? The reality is that demons answer to one demon. We call him Satan, we call him Lucifer, he's known by different names. The Bible calls him the accuser of the brothers. This is a being that made a decision somewhere along the way that he was beautiful enough, that he was powerful enough, that he was strong enough, and he resented bowing his knees before the one who sat on the throne. In fact, in his mind, the throne really would be better served if it was his. As he was cast out of heaven, he turned his attention to the one part of creation that most reminds him of the one who sits on the throne. That is, human men and women who the Bible tells us are created, what? In the image of God. Now see, our generation doesn't believe that. We have been effectively persuaded by the demonic to believe the idea, and we've believed it for about 150 years at least since Darwin proposed his theory of evolution. We have bought into the lie that human beings are merely the highest level of the animal kingdom. In fact, the reality is when sin dominates us, when we live a life that is given over completely to sin, what happens is we produce a kind of animal-like existence. The habits sexually, the pursuit of appetites, the living almost by instinctual reflections, we behave like animals. And yet the reality is, even though the image of God in us has been hidden, has been scarred, has been damaged in a sense by sin, we are not just animals. We are foundationally different from animals. I love people that go, well, you're only 2%, your DNA is only 2% different from a chimpanzee. Okay. The implication of things that when we say things like that, the implication is that, there is 6 of one, half a dozen of another. We're really not that different from the apes. You ever watched the apes? There are some human beings who act like apes, but they are not the ones that we hold up and go, this is what we all strive to be, man. This is who we want. This is what we want to be. No, that animal-like behavior is a result of sin. It's a result of buying into this lie that we're not different from the animals. But it's because the liar who's whispering those things in our ears, he hates the image of God that he sees in us. The whole point of demonic oppression is, here's his strategy, and we're going to see it in this passage. His strategy is to create confusion about who we are. His strategy is to control the way we live. And his strategy is to conquer us as a sort of coup d'etat against the one who has authority over the whole universe. Now, let's look and see how this unfolds. This passage starts with Jesus confronting persistent unbelief, or what I've said here about Satan. This is Satan sowing confusion, and Jesus has to step in. The Father tells the story, and he says, your disciples weren't able to help. And in verse 19, Jesus answered and said, and he's clearly speaking to the disciples here, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? You see, what's going on here is that they have fallen victim to something that marks the American church by and large, and it's this idea that because we've been hanging around Jesus, that we've been exposed to Jesus enough that we have all that we need to be better versions of ourselves. The modern church is sold on this idea that Jesus is a self-help guru, and he comes alongside and he sort of polishes off my rough edges. He makes me kinder. He makes me gentler. He makes me more winsome in my relationship with people, and that's all I need. I was a pretty good person to start with. I just need Jesus to kind of dress me up around the rough edges. The disciples, Jesus, in a moment of exasperation, it's interesting, Jesus shows incredible patience all the way through the Gospels. The only places he ever really gets exasperated is with his own disciples and with his enemies. And here he's like, oh, unbelieving generation. You know what he's saying to the disciples? He's saying, listen, these scribes right here, they've rejected me. I mean, they're not with me, because they flat out rejected me. You, on the other hand, you haven't rejected me, but you act like all you needed was a little bit of me to sort of get you over the hump. But the reality is, whether we reject Jesus or whether we just want a little bit of him, we end up in the same place, which is the place of unbelief. You see, here's what we tell ourselves in America. We say, yeah, I like Jesus and I like going to church, but I don't want to be weird. I mean, if I give myself completely to Jesus, he might make me a fanatic. I mean, he might make me just, the kind of person other people whisper about. He might make me weird. Well, let me put your mind at ease. If you give yourself completely to Jesus, he is definitely going to make you weird. But here's the reality. In an insane asylum, it's the sane people who are weird. We live in a generation that is marked by believing every lie that has ever been presented out of hell. And those who follow truth are thought to be weird. But there is a day and a time, and it's coming, when we will be with the Lord, and the whole cosmos will say, wow, look at those people. They had it right all along. You don't want to give yourself to Jesus because he might make you too much different from all the people you hang out with. But you need to understand that's exactly his purpose. I was at St. Francis Hospital a few years ago. This was the first time it ever happened. I've been there many times since then. I didn't realize until it happened that at St. Francis Hospital at 6 a.m. in the morning, somebody comes on the sound system over the whole hospital and prays a prayer. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been there on a lot of mornings when I've heard a lot of really cool prayers, okay? But on this one particular morning, I'll never forget it. The voice came over the intercom and he clears his throat and then he begins the prayer. And in the prayer, he says this, Lord, help us to be more completely ourselves today. I'm like, dear Jesus, please do not answer that prayer. Because see, I know what it looks like when I'm completely myself. My prayer is not, Lord Jesus, help me be completely myself today. My prayer is, Lord Jesus, help me be more like you today. That's what I'm going for. But guess what? They thought Jesus was weird in his day. The more we look like Jesus, the more they're going to think we're weird today. But folks, let me tell you, that is the way of truth. It's the way of reality. It's the way of righteousness. So you got to decide, who is it that you want to impress? Satan loves to create confusion because he wants us to look for our approval in the wrong places. He wants us to want to be like everybody else around us because then we fit in. Listen, if you've come to Jesus Christ, God help you if you try and fit into this world, because you don't and you never will. We were made, we were created, we were redeemed, and we were gifted for a different kind of life. He looks at the disciples and he says, you haven't rejected me, but because you don't really believe in me, there's no way to distinguish you from the scribes. You're both a part of an unbelieving generation. How long am I going to put up with this? Well, he turns to the father and he says, they brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around, foaming at the mouth. Now, it's interesting because they've just come down. Remember, Peter wanted to stay up on the mountaintop? The transfiguration, that was a pretty incredible moment. And Jesus said, no, we can't stay here. We got to go back down. Think about the spiritual whiplash. They've gone from glimpsing the glory of Jesus Christ, and they stroll back down the mountain to immediately encounter demon possession. You see, if there's one thing the three of them realize, they are back in the real world now. And so they see this boy, and he is a sight. He's rolling around, foaming at the mouth. Now, like I said, some scholars write this off as epilepsy. I think that the best way to make sense of this passage, at least for me, is to recognize that it is probably two things simultaneously. It is probably epilepsy, a physical malady. It is also demon oppression. Now, when the demon sees Jesus, he immediately begins to try and destroy the boy. He throws him down, he's rolling over. And Jesus, and I love this about Jesus never panics. If that's happened in front of me, I'm like, okay, we got to do something. We got to figure this out. Jesus sees what's going on, and he turns to the Father and he goes, how long has it been like this? Not panicked at all. I love that. And the Father goes, from childhood. Now, the reason I'm probably spending too much time here, but the reason I want to distinguish that I think there is epilepsy and there is demonic oppression, and they're happening side by side in this situation, is because the epilepsy had been there from childhood. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that children are open to demonic oppression. Okay, I don't want that to be your takeaway from this passage. I do think that because of the epilepsy, there was probably a moment somewhere along the way in the father pursuing any solution he could find, trying anything he could come up with to solve this problem. At some point, there was an invitation that produced demonic oppression. The epilepsy and the demonic oppression don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think in this situation, they can be side by side. Now, let this unfold because I think you'll see where I'm going. The boy is rolling around, he's foaming at the mouth, and he's having an episode. And Jesus said, how long has he been like this? He says, from childhood. And in that moment, Jesus is aware that Satan is involved through one of his minions. And to deal with this situation in the boy's life is what Jesus always did when it came to Satan. It is a reversal of death and an affirmation of life. Anytime Satan is dethroned from the life of a person, sometimes it's dramatically like this moment of demonic incursion. But anytime someone comes out of a life of sin and meets Jesus Christ, Satan is knocked off of one throne that was in that life. You say, well, here's the thing. one of the things that Satan whispers in our ears, this business about confession and confusion and control, is he's led us to believe that the life that we live before we meet Christ is actually fun. I've talked to people who'll be like, I don't want to become a Christian because, I'm having too much fun. You're having too much fun in a lifestyle that is designed from the get-go to destroy you, to make you subject to the lowest realities of broken human nature, of taking you to a place where you have no ability to control your life. Listen, this idea that I'm giving up the fun life if I come to Jesus, it's a lie from one who's not trying to give you fun. He's trying to destroy you. We've got to recognize what's happening here. Jesus looks at this and he's going to deal with this situation in front of his disciples. And he looks at the Father, and the Father's like, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus, verse 23, Jesus said, if you can. Now get this, Jesus is not insulted. That's not what's happening here. But this Father, this is such a beautiful picture of salvation by justification, salvation by faith. Let me explain it to you. Part of the reason I believe Mark included this story is because what we have here is a father who is coming with an unsolvable problem. And he comes to Jesus and he says, if you can do anything, would you fix this? And Jesus says, if you can do anything? And the Father's response is beautiful. I believe. Help my unbelief. One of the things that when I watch movies, I don't do this on purpose, but I tend to identify myself with one of the characters in the movie. It's usually not the hero, and it's usually not the villain. It's usually some person in the story somewhere, and I'm like, there it is. That's me right there. In this story, I so very much identify with the Father. Lord, if you could do this, if I can, Lord, yes, I believe, but help my unbelief. The reason this is such a beautiful picture of salvation is because I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people where I've had to pick up the pieces of an abusive church situation where they're going through some kind of crisis, or there's a health issue, or there's something else, and they've been told right to their face, God's not going to solve this problem for you because you don't have strong enough faith. Let me tell you about this Father. When he says, help my unbelief, he is not asking for Jesus to strengthen his faith so that his faith will be strong enough to be worthy of Jesus doing something for him. See, that's what's often said to these situations. Well, if you were a better Christian, if you had more faith, if you could trust God more, then God would do more. Listen, here's what we need to understand, particularly when this comes to salvation. It's not that we come to Jesus and go, hey, listen, I want to be a Christian. I want to be saved. I want to go to heaven. And I've made it like 37.3% of the way. So if you could just, cover the shortfall, if you could just cover the rest of it, then we'd be good. If that's the way you approach Jesus, you are not saved. Because the way that we approach Jesus is we say, I'm coming to you because I have no place else to go. And I have zero to offer in this transaction. There's nothing here that I can do that you can just make up the shortfall. My shortfall is 100%. I can't solve the unsolvable problem of the sinful human condition. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. You see, the I believe part was that he came to Jesus in the first place. That's the thing. When I have a plumbing problem at my house, there are always two pieces of reality that interact. The first piece is I look my plumbing problem square in the face, and I realize from hard-learned experience that I have no hope of solving that problem. That's really the first step. Because as long as you have the illusion in your mind that you can fix the problem, you're going to keep working at it. And what happens to the problem? It keeps getting worse. I have never made a plumbing problem better in my whole life. Not one time. I always make it worse. So the first part of that transaction is I got to recognize, I'm not fixing that. I can't do that. The second part is I have to call someone that I have confidence in that knows how to fix the problem. That is precisely not just salvation, but that is the way we are called to live the Christian life. When it comes to salvation, as long as you think that you can fix your life, you can turn over a new leaf, you can start fresh, you can open a new book, you can begin a new chapter. We've got all these kinds of things that say, I'm going to be different tomorrow than I was yesterday. As long as you keep thinking that, your plumbing problem is just going to get worse and worse and worse. You have to recognize that you can't solve the problem. But then you have to turn to somebody that with confidence you say, this person can solve the problem. And spiritually speaking, that person is Jesus. That's how we come to Christ, with empty hands, the plumber has never once said, hey, get down here under the sink with me and help me. You know, he's always like, don't you have a television or something you could just go watch for a little bit? Why? Because I have nothing to contribute. That's the spiritual reality of salvation. The only thing you contributed to your salvation was the sin that got you in the jam in the first place. But it's the way we live the Christian life after salvation. It's this process of saying, I can't go through a day on my own. Don't buy into the illusion that because I go to church, I've been around Jesus enough that I've just sort of absorbed some things by osmosis. I'm a little bit more like Jesus. You see, we don't want to be weird. We don't want to be fanatical. We don't want to be different. We want to have just enough of Jesus so that we're more confident in ourselves. That was the 9 disciples. They had just enough of Jesus that they thought, I can handle it from here. You can't. You can't live the Christian life because you're smart enough or good enough or talented enough to live it. You live it only by a daily dose of the presence of Jesus flowing through you. Now, how do I know this is true? Well, look where this goes. He was confronting persistent unbelief. He was countering demonic opposition. That's it. That is, he sends this spiritual beast out of the boy. In verse 26, it says, after crying out and throwing him into a terrible convulsions, that's a demonic temper tantrum. The boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he stood up. It's fascinating, really, this argument that I'm trying to make, that there was epilepsy and demonic oppression side by side in this situation, I think is seen in the cure, because the boy's epilepsy stopped, his symptoms stopped with when with a scream the demon departed, but then he was limp like a rag. I mean, they said he looks like he's dead. We have some families in our church that have dealt with epilepsy. And after a real serious and severe episode, when it stops, there's a kind of limpness, a kind of deadness. Was this boy actually dead and Jesus resurrected him? The Greek language could allow that. Was he just, by exhaustion, unconscious? It doesn't matter. What we see here is that Jesus reaches down and helps him stand up. And in the moment, he has solved the epilepsy problem, that's healing. He has solved the demonic oppression, that's exorcism. In other words, Jesus was the answer to all the problems. Well, now we have to figure out what went wrong. Confessing spiritual necessities. Look at verse 28. And when Jesus came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot come out by anything but prayer." Prayer, especially a whole life of prayer, is the avenue of faith. It is the way that we communicate our necessary dependence on God. It is only by reliance upon the unlimited power of God that we access through prayer that disciples can challenge the malignant spiritual forces of our day. Occasionally, I get questions from people about prayer, and they'll say things like, well, what's the point of praying if God already knows everything? I mean, it's not like I'm giving him any new information. Well, what's the point of prayer? If God's going to accomplish his will, why bother asking about anything? God's going to do what he's going to do. Both of those statements betray a really poor understanding of what prayer is. Prayer is not merely putting your card in the ATM and punching the right buttons so that you get out of it what you need. Prayer is not just taking my laundry list to God. Think about it this way. What if my wife, what if on Sunday afternoons, what if I came to my wife every Sunday afternoon and I said, here's my list for the week. I need you to do these things. Get back to me when they're done, and I'll have another list for you next Sunday. And that was the extent of our relationship. And that is the recipe for you having a single pastor, is what that is. But isn't that exactly what we do with God? God, here's my list for the week. I need to give you this, and I'll have a new list next week. If you'll just handle this, I'll get back to you when the next list is finished. The fact of the matter is, that's not what prayer is. Prayer is about time together with God in his presence. It is about sharing moments together with him. And it's in that sharing of moments that we acknowledge our insufficiency. We claim his sufficiency, and we ask him to be at work in us and through us and around us to do what he wants to do and to let us get to be in on that. Jesus says, listen, you thought that you had my power and that it was just in your back pocket at your disposal for you to pull out and use anytime you wanted. That's not how this works. You don't have my power unless you have me. The key is not, oh, I'm a Christian, I can now lay claim to anything that has to do with the name of Jesus. No, we are empowered daily as we come into the presence of the Lord. That's how he makes us sufficient to the moment. You see, in Mark chapter 6, when they went out, they had been with Jesus. And he sent them out specifically to do that. And he had their power because they had been with him. In this instance, they didn't think Jesus was necessary to be there because they could handle it. The minute we think that we have enough of Jesus and we'll just take it from here, we have completely lost our minds. He says, boys, this kind only comes out by prayer. In other words, this is a spiritual battle that requires you to be engaged with me personally. Well, they get up from there and they leave. Verse 30. From there they went out and were going through Galilee, and he was not wanting anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise again 3 days later. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Here's the thing. Jesus introduces a new piece of teaching right here. Now, for several weeks, a couple of weeks now, we go back to the scene where he asks, who do people say that I am? And Peter steps up and he says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And at that moment, remember, I showed you that Jesus turned from 2 years of teaching in parables and in mysterious kind of language. He now begins to teach just the disciples explicitly what's going to happen. No more symbolism, no more stories. He says the Son of Man has to suffer many things. He will be rejected and he will die, and then he will come back to life. He's now talking to them bluntly, plainly, openly about what's coming. But here, following the lesson of their inability to cast out this demon, Jesus adds one more element that's new to this teaching. They leave and they're walking through Galilee, but he doesn't want the crowds. He's just teaching the 12. Now, he's still on his way to Jerusalem. They don't realize that that's where we're headed, but he's still working his way towards Jerusalem. But in this moment, he adds one new piece of information. He'd been teaching them for a couple of weeks. The Son of Man is going to suffer many things. He's going to be rejected. He's going to die. He's going to come back to life. But do you see what he added here for the first time? The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise again 3 days later. It was immediately after their failure to use his power, because they were trying to do it with his name, but in their own power, that he adds a new piece of teaching to what he's been teaching them. The Son of Man will have to suffer many things. He will be rejected. He will die. He will come back to life. But for the first time, Jesus adds another element. He says, oh, by the way, the dying part, it will be by betrayal. Someone will hand me over. Now, here's the thing about betrayal. Betrayal is a desperate crime. Because, by definition, you can't betray somebody that you're an enemy with. You can't betray somebody you don't know. You can't betray somebody who's a long distance from you. Betrayal, by definition, has to be done up close and personal by somebody that you trust. What Jesus is saying is he's just introduced a new piece of understanding for them, that this suffering many things and being rejected and dying, there's another element to be considered. I'm going to be betrayed. Who on the planet was in a position to betray Jesus Christ? It didn't take long to do the math. There were only 12 possible suspects. And from this moment forward, there is a real awareness that if we repeat what we did with the boy and the demon, if we try and do this on our own, essentially, we side with Satan, who said there's another way. There's an easier way. You don't have to follow Jesus. You don't have to be weird. It says that they didn't understand what he was saying, but they were afraid to ask. Of course they were afraid to ask. There's only one question to ask. Will it be me? Nobody wanted to say that out loud. Here's the point. The enemy if you can piece together his strategy, he wants to confuse us. He wants us to be confused as to who we are in Jesus Christ. He wants us to not understand who we are as special creatures made in the image of God. He wants control. That's why he offers us temptation, because he wants to redirect our focus. He wants to draw us away from the things that are true and noble and pure. And he wants to put us in a place where he can have influence. And third, I would say conquest, but really, it's not conquest. Probably a better word is coup d'etat. You see, the enemy still has not figured out that he is not going to win this battle. He is never going to sit on that throne. But he's still fighting the fight because he thinks he's the one who should be the supreme God of the cosmos. For us, we can't be confused about who we are in Christ. We didn't add anything. We didn't bring anything. It is all something Christ has done for us. We need to be clear on that. But because of what Christ has done in us, we are not just animals. We are divinely empowered creatures that God designed to be in relationship with him. We have to want that. We have to yearn for that. Your quiet time, your time in the Word, your time in prayer, it's not because you're trying to check a box so that you have done all the spiritual obligations that your church requires of you. It's because you want to be in the presence of Jesus. You want to have that relationship. Be clear about who you are. Don't be subject to the confusion of the devil. Don't give in to his control. That's where temptation comes in. The Bible tells us that every temptation comes with a way of escape. So hunt for it, search for it, find the way of escape, and don't give in to temptation. You say, well, it's just so strong, it just pulls me. That's why you got to be with Jesus, because you need his power to face those moments of malignant evil that come to you. And the coup d'etat, we will not side with the rebels in this cosmic battle. We will place ourselves, even at the expense of the world thinking we're weird, we will walk with Jesus, and we will give ourselves only to him. If you don't know Jesus Christ, there's really nothing that can be said more than you've already been told until you say, I have nothing to offer him, but I know he's the answer. I believe, but help my unbelief. Jesus doesn't increase your belief so that you're worthy of salvation. He hears your cry of insufficiency, and he answers not on the basis of how strong your faith is. He answers on the basis of how great his love is. Come to Jesus. Maybe you're a believer, but you've been sidetracked by all of these other things, and you've fallen victim to this idea that you've got enough Jesus to get you into heaven and you'll handle everything down here on earth. Listen, it's time to lay down the illusion of your sufficiency and let Jesus empower you, infill you, give you what you need to live the life that he's invited you to live. Maybe you need to be a part of a community of faith. Maybe you need to be a part of a church of people who are not perfect, but man, we are walking shoulder to shoulder trying to help each other along the way. Maybe that's what you need. Why don't you come talk to one of our pastors? We'd love to pray with you about your salvation. We'd love to pray with you about sort of getting back into the game and renewing the commitment of your walk with Christ. We'd love to talk to you about what it means to be a part of this church. You don't have to be perfect to get in here. You just have to be saved. You can attend, but if you want to be in the community, this is a community of those who know Jesus, who are being transformed by Him. If there's anything about that, in that secret place, that you have this impulse to know more about that, come talk to us, because we'd love to share it with you. We don't have all the answers, but we know the guy that is the answer to every problem. We'd love to introduce you. We're going to sing in just a moment, but let's pray first. Father, thank you for this lesson, this remarkable story of a father and a son who present themselves and become the means by which Jesus teaches us that He is the only complete answer to every problem. Father, in this place, I pray that you would have your way among us, that we would be submissive to the impulse of your Spirit, and that, Lord, there would be nobody here who walks out with the illusion that they just need a little bit of Jesus. Let us be reminded that we are nothing, and that as we put our nothing into your hands, something extraordinary takes place. Lord, find your people here, our hearts wholly devoted to you. This is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.